Hey there everybody, I'm Joe the Disney Guy and welcome to another Disney Guy review. Today we're going to be taking a look at the film that quite possibly saved the animation department at the Disney Studios. It's time we take a look at The Great Mouse Detective. In the middle of production on The Rescuers, members of the Disney animation staff already had an eye towards future projects. Talk turned to adapting the tales of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes to animation, with the idea of portraying the world's famous detective as a dog. But it wasn't until veteran layout artist Joe Hale got involved that the project started to get legs. Hale suggested, instead of adapting the stories of Sherlock Holmes, to instead adapt the children's book series Basil of Baker Street by Eve Titus. Much like the Disney plans, Basil of Baker Street was a play on Sherlock Holmes, where the titular Basil was billed as the Sherlock Holmes of the mouse world. However, very quickly the project fell into production limbo, due to the story having too many similarities to Disney's current project, The Rescuers. Interestingly enough, this fear of comparison to The Rescuers was something the animators kept in mind throughout production, all the way through the marketing of the film. Also, clearly at the studio, there was a bit of an obsession with mice around this time. Well, I suppose more than usual. Within about 8 years, The Rescuers, The Secret of Nim, Mickey's Christmas Carol, and Basil of Baker Street were all pitched to the studio, with 3 of those going into production. After a few years on the shelf, young animator Ron Clements, who had actually gotten his job at Disney due to his work on an animated short featuring Sherlock Holmes, brought up the Basil story again to Disney executives. With Disney's current production, The Black Cauldron, plagued with issues and unhappy animators, Disney's president, Ron Miller, decided that Basil of Baker Street would be a good alternative project for the studio, and approved for the film to move ahead into development in 1982. The first decision for Basil of Baker Street was to attach John Musker, who had recently been removed from the Black Cauldron project due to creative disagreements, as co-director, alongside veteran animator Bernie Mattinson, fresh off his work writing, producing, and directing Mickey's Christmas Carol. The two would eventually be joined by another veteran animator, Dave Michener, to create a trio of directors for Basil. So already it feels like this film was off to a better start production-wise than The Black Cauldron, or at least the studio was being smarter about it. Musker was kinda hung out to dry on Cauldron, a first-time director trying to manage the rift between veteran and rookie animators, but this time he was flanked by 2 veterans, which not only took some of the heat off his directorial debut, but also helped add a seasoned Disney touch to the production. The story team got to work on adapting Eve Titus' series to film, but much like some previous Disney films, very quickly the story strayed from Titus' original work. Small elements, such as changing Professor Ratigan from a bulky mouse sometimes mistaken for a rat to an actual rat, and large elements, such as altering Dr. Dawson's personality from intelligent partner to bumbling sidekick, were changed in the name of giving Basil of Baker Street a story fit for the screen. Other characters were added, altered, and removed as well. Initially, the character of Olivia was much older, and was to serve as a potential love interest for either Dawson or Basil, depending on the version. But Ron Miller suggested making Olivia a child to garner sympathy from the audience. Stool pigeon characters, who hung around Buckingham Palace and gave tips to Basil, were also dropped in favor of allowing Basil to sort out the mystery for himself. Much of the story was also written by first deciding what settings they wanted the story to go to, and filling in the blanks as to how they got there later. Apparently, the writers didn't even know what crime they wanted Ratigan to commit in the film, but they did know that, being set in London, they wanted Basil to visit Buckingham Palace, so how do you get him there? Well, have Ratigan just try to usurp the Queen, of course. Kind of a unique way to look at storytelling, and also kind of an interesting exercise to try if you ever get hit with writer's block during a creative project. The main characters were also conceived far differently than they ended up being. Initially, Basil was cold and calculating, much like his counterpart Sherlock Holmes, but Miller felt this made the character too unlikable. In response, the animators then based Basil's personality on laid-back singer Bing Crosby, but that too didn't quite work. As for Ratigan, he was originally portrayed as thin and weaselly to match his evil personality. But both Basil and Ratigan saw the characters changed and honed in on thanks to film study and casting. The animators studied the 1950 comedy Champagne for Caesar in order to study actor Ronald Colman as a potential inspiration for Basil's personality. Instead, they came across the villain of the movie, played by Vincent Price, and decided that his over-the-top and energetic portrayal would be perfect for Ratigan. With this new larger-than-life personality also came a redesign to make Ratigan broader, and the new design was actually based off of Ron Miller, a former football player. As for Basil, animator Rob Minkoff suggested looking into actor Leslie Howard's role of Henry Higgins in 1938's Pygmalion for inspiration. And it was this role, in addition to the man cast as Basil, Shakespearean-trained actor Barry Ingham, that finally nailed down Basil's eccentric yet brilliant personality. Apparently Ingham was so perfect for the role that not only did he secure the casting for the role within 6 minutes of his audition starting, but part of that audition was actually used in the finished movie itself. Talk about knocking your audition out of the park. Ingham and Price would be joined by American actor and British accent specialist Val Benton as David Q. Dawson, untrained Scottish child actress Suzanne Polachek as Olivia Flaversham, who got the role over hundreds of other applicants, Alan Young as Hiram Flaversham, who was cast due to his authentic Scottish accent which he had just displayed as Scrooge McDuck in Mickey's Christmas Carol, and radio star Candy Candido as Fidget, whose recordings were actually sped up in order to raise the pitch of his naturally low voice. Another actor who was technically listed in the cast for this movie is Basil Rathbones as Sherlock Holmes. Rathbone voiced the famous detective in a recording of the story The Red-Headed League, and Disney actually used excerpts from this recording in their movie. Now, of course, there was a torrid legal battle over the rights to use these excerpts, and Disney actually had another actor re-record these lines just in case, but luckily everything got settled in time before the movie came out. Also, yes, Basil Rathbones is where Eve Titus decided to get the name of Basil for our great mouse detective. Things were moving along for Basil at Baker Street until 1984, when a seismic shift in the Disney organization put the film in jeopardy. Ron Miller had been forced out of the company, and replacing him were former Paramount executives Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg. Because of this new management team, Basil at Baker Street had to be re-pitched and re-greenlit by the newcomers in order to continue production. John Musker, Ron Clements, and Bernie Mattinson spent 3 hours with Eisner and Katzenberg, who had never worked with an animated feature before, going over outlines and storyboards. The two new executives were apparently left baffled by the storyboard process, having been used to traditional screenplays, but decided to allow production to continue anyway, allegedly due to Katzenberg's claim that if they were going to be paying these animators anyway, they may as well have something to work on. However, it wasn't a complete victory for the animation team, who not only saw their budget slashed from $24 million to $10 million, but also had their release date pushed up a full year, from Christmas 1987 to July 1986. Now, these changes may seem malicious, and who knows, it may have partially been a way to try to get the company away from animated features, but I'll give the benefit of the doubt and say that Eisner and Katzenberg just didn't really understand animated features at the time. They came from a world of live-action features, where family films like E.T. and Star Wars had budgets between $10 and $15 million, and movies were just made faster than the 5 years that were allotted for Basil. With their timeline dramatically pushed up, and now missing a producer due to Miller's departure, Mattinson was promoted to producer-director for the film. But quickly, the abbreviated production time was causing Mattinson to be too bogged down by both roles, so he elected to focus solely on producing the film. In his place, Ron Clements, who had been heavily involved in the project since its conception anyway, was named co-director. Numerous scenes also started to be cut from the feature, due to both the shorter than expected production time and complaints from Eisner and Katzenberg about the pacing of the film being too slow. When it was all said and done, Basil at Baker Street had been cut down to a brisk 74-minute runtime from its originally conceived 90-minute runtime. This point I've always had a contention with, because maybe it's just a product of the times, but 90 minutes doesn't feel like that long of a movie to me. In fact, it feels kind of short, and 74 minutes feels, quite frankly, like too short of a movie. I think that Eisner and Katzenberg may have underestimated the attention span of children, especially when you present them with something that they're actually interested in. With budget and time tightening on the crew, the animators began to look to computers as a potential cheaper and faster way to pump out animation, and it was because of this new CGI animation that the film's climax was changed. Originally, the climactic battle between Basil and Ratigan took place on the hands of Big Ben, but animator Mike Peraza, inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's Castle of Cagliostro, suggested bringing the fight inside Big Ben onto the gears of the iconic clock tower. Peraza and his wife, after many requests to the English government, were given unprecedented access inside Big Ben to study the location for the scene. So what made this research interesting is that the bells in Big Ben actually chime every 15 minutes as opposed to every hour. And believe it or not, those bells are pretty loud when you're inside the tower itself. So Peraza actually finished all of his research within the tower in 10 minutes to avoid the incredibly loud chimes of the bells. Imagineers Tad Glow and Phil Nibelink were the primary computer animators. The two essentially plotted a geometric background of the moving gears into the computer, which then drew those points onto paper, allowing for the traditional animators to transfer those drawings onto animation cells, and then insert the characters into the 3D environment. So a couple of interesting tidbits on the computer animation for this film. So CGI was obviously a very different beast back then, as a computer that was used for rendering would run so hot that the animators actually had to leave their office door open overnight so as to not overheat the computer. So unfortunately one night when a friendly janitor saw an office door open and decided to be a nice guy and close it for them, well, yeah, the computer sort of blew up and they lost all their work from that night, which, quite frankly, sounds like a nightmare. Also, Nibelink concluded after working on the CGI for this film that computer animation would never be able to match the personality that could be infused with hand-drawn animation. And though I think he was right for a very long time, it just goes to show you that CGI has come a really, really long way since the 80s, and I think that this past decade or so is proof to that. As the project moved along, though, Eisner and Katzenberg still expressed some concerns. Composer Henry Mancini, who became popular due to his work on the Pink Panther, supplied the score for the film and also penned the songs, including a parody of British Victorian music entitled Are You the One Who Loves Me? Katzenberg disapproved of the song, wanting something more contemporary for the younger audiences, and Eisner insisted that a popular artist be brought in to sing the song, going so far as to suggest Michael Jackson or Madonna. Although the directors and animators rebuked Eisner's suggestions, they did bring on Grammy Award-winning and Academy Award-nominated singer Melissa Manchester to both write and perform the sultry Let Me Be Good to You. Again, I do have to defend Eisner and Katzenberg here. Although it may have seemed a little silly to insist on shoehorning pop singers into the film, it was this concept of writing contemporary music for films that arguably led to some of Disney's biggest musical triumphs in the ensuing decades, so maybe the idea wasn't that crazy after all. Unfortunately, the music wasn't where Eisner and Katzenberg's concerns for the film ended. Due to the box office failure that was Paramount's Young Sherlock Holmes, Eisner and Katzenberg wanted to distance themselves from that project, and began to fear that Basil of Baker Street was too British for American audiences. Subtle changes, like changing Basil out of his Sherlock Holmes-inspired outfit for the poster, were made, and there were even considerations of redubbing the film with American accents for the US release. But one non-subtle change that was made was the changing of the film's title to the far less British-sounding Great Mouse Detective. Despite management's claims that this title tested better with audiences, the animators were up in arms over the change, going so far as to release a fake memo throughout the studio stating that past Disney titles would be changed as well to be more audience-friendly. Some gems that were included in this memo were 7 Little Men Help a Girl, The Girl with the See-Through Shoes, The Wonderful Elephant Who Could Really Fly, and 2 Dogs Fall in Love. Now, of course, 2 men who weren't as amused by this memo were Eisner and Katzenberg, who actually launched an investigation to try to find the animator who released this memo. Though they never were successful in finding out who did it, they did withdraw a lot of marketing and support for the film, partially due to fears of it not being a success, and partially just due to plain old-fashioned retaliation, which, yeah, does seem pretty petty in the grand scheme of things. But despite management's concerns, The Great Mouse Detective continued to move ahead as scheduled, and on July 2nd, 1986, the film was finally released into theaters.
I'm lost. I'm trying to find Basil of Baker Street.
So clearly, Disney's new management was pretty concerned about how The Great Mouse Detective would turn out, but the question is, were those concerns warranted? Well, while I can certainly understand being a little wary, especially after what I feel was a subpar effort in The Black Cauldron, the overwhelming answer in regards to The Great Mouse Detective is no. There wasn't any need to be concerned because this is a fun, upbeat movie that definitely helped put Disney animation back on track. Right off the bat, the animation is bright and fun, and it feels much more in the traditional Disney style than their last venture. I promise, I'm not going to spend the entire review comparing The Great Mouse Detective to The Black Cauldron, but the differences between the two films are just so striking, especially when you consider how close the two movies are released to each other, that it's kinda hard not to right off the bat. But anyway, back to the positives. The pacing was kind of an interesting point throughout the film. Clearly, the pace is brisk. The opening scene shows the crime being committed, and within 10 minutes, we're right in the thick of the plot. But despite this fast pace, the film never feels like it's out of control. Part of that might be because there's just not a lot of background necessarily needed, especially if you already understand the basics of Sherlock Holmes. But I think the real reasoning is just that the story itself is engaging and fun. So instead of focusing on how fast the story is moving, I found myself instead focusing on how much I was enjoying the story. And yeah, I probably would have enjoyed some of those slower, prettier moments which are apparently lost in development, and those moments, as well as maybe a little bit more time devoted to character and plot development, probably could have elevated the film even more. But in all honesty, despite the unusually short running time, I didn't feel cheated by this story, and I didn't feel like I was missing something when it was all said and done. Now, if you guys are familiar with the channel, you'll know that this is a pretty rare phenomena. I'm almost always harping on pacing, and I'm almost always against overly fast pacing, but it really is a credit to the directors, especially with the restrictions that they faced, to come up with a fast-paced film that didn't feel like a fast-paced film. Aside from the fun story though, I have to make special mention of the music in The Great Mouse Detective. The songs are kind of interesting because while I wouldn't exactly classify them as memorable, I found myself constantly having to look up their names, they are still pretty entertaining. The World's Greatest Criminal Mind is a silly, yet sort of underrated villain song. Let Me Be Good to You is an unusually risque number, especially by Disney standards, and I defy you to find a funnier song than Goodbye So Soon, which had me audibly laughing throughout the scene. But even more than the actual songs, Henry Mancini's score is pretty great throughout, blending the mysterious with the action-packed. The film's climactic chase, which does look incredible with surprisingly smooth CGI for the time period, is aided tremendously and made even more exciting by Mancini's dynamic score in the background. Honestly, just go listen to the song playing during that scene called Big Ben Chase, and if you close your eyes, you can almost see the scene unfolding before you. Now that's the sign of a successful score. But the real triumph of The Great Mouse Detective, in my opinion, is its characters, in particular Basil and Ratigan. Both characters are basically two sides of the same coin, with their over-the-top and eccentric personalities. And the dynamic between the two, how they're basically playing a prolonged game of intelligence one-upsmanship, I thought was one of the most enjoyable threads throughout the movie. And although characters like Dawson and Olivia are perfectly likable, Basil and Ratigan just take over nearly every scene that they're in. Whether it's Basil's energetic and, at times, nonsensical running of an experiment, or Ratigan's flamboyant and threatening scheming. And I have to make special mention of Vincent Price, who just brings so much life to Ratigan with his deliciously evil and exaggerated portrayal. I'll be honest, I had never really considered Ratigan much when I thought about my favorite members of Disney's Rogue Gallery. But after watching this film again, I do think he's a pretty underrated Disney villain. And I really think that part of the reason why I enjoyed Ratigan as much as I did was because of Vincent Price's spot-on voice work. It really is a testament to how great of an actor Vincent Price was that he could still put in such a high-energy performance in his 70s. Though I suppose I really shouldn't be doubting the man whom Michael Jackson entrusted with supplying the most famous laugh in music history. In the end, the word I keep coming back to describe this film is fun, because it really is the best way to describe it. Is it a masterpiece on the level of future films that John Musker and Ron Clements would collaborate on? No, probably not, but honestly, with everything that went on during the production of this film, it was never meant to or going to be. Instead, what we got was a return to the entertaining and, in a lot of respects, old-school Disney animation that we all came to know and love, which helped make The Great Mouse Detective a comfortable return home and a positive step in the right direction for Disney animated features. The Great Mouse Detective opened to extremely positive reviews from audiences and critics alike. Most critics praised the return to form from Disney Animation, with Siskel and Ebert going so far as to call it Disney's best animated venture in the last 25 years. But possibly even more important, the film was financially successful as well, drawing $50 million worldwide against its $14 million budget in its initial release. This financial draw helped prove to Disney's new management that animated features could still be successful, and in many ways helped ensure the life of animated features at the Disney studio. Now, as successful and important as all this was, and believe me, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows at the Disney studio. 4 months later, An American Tail would be released by Disney's new nemesis, Don Bluth, and the film would go on to become the highest-grossing non-Disney animated film of all time, and would outgross Great Mouse Detective by $22 million. So, while it was certainly a positive step in the right direction for Disney, they still had a long way to go before reclaiming their place as the king of animation. The film was re-released once, in February of 1992, and pulled in another $13.2 million. But despite this critical and financial success, The Great Mouse Detective hasn't seen a lot of life from Disney outside of theaters. There's been almost no presence of The Great Mouse Detective in the Disney parks, aside from the short-lived meet-and-greet characters of Basil and Ratigan. True story, the money used to make those costumes was actually fronted by Roy E. Disney himself, and the reason for this, and the reason why The Great Mouse Detective has sort of flown under Disney's radar in general, still stems back to that decision to pull back marketing funds before the movie. Just goes to show you that if you don't promote something, it's liable to be lost to history even if it's successful. But The Great Mouse Detective's most enduring legacy is the one it left on the studio itself. Aside from it guaranteeing the life of Disney animation for at least a little while longer, the successful CGI used for the film would be a catalyst for further and more expansive uses of computer animation in the future. And the film's success ensured that the directing duo of John Musker and Ron Clements would get further assignments from Disney's executives. I wonder if those two ever went on to do anything as popular or successful as The Great Mouse Detective. Guess we'll just have to keep going and find out, won't we? So all in all, although The Great Mouse Detective tends to be one of Disney's most underrated and at times forgotten films, its importance, both as a film and to the studio as a whole, cannot be overstated. And it was a positive first step in putting Disney animation back on track. A track that would eventually lead to some of the greatest animated triumphs in movie history. Well guys, that wraps it up for me this week. I hope you all enjoyed, and let me know what your thoughts are on The Great Mouse Detective. Also be sure to subscribe to my channel, follow me on Twitter for all updates involving myself and the channel, and check out my Patreon page if you guys want to help support the channel even more. Also be sure to check out one of these fine videos floating around my head right now, and I'll be sure to see you all real soon.
I'll say so long and go so soon.